A black homeless war hero on trial. What happens when the judge hears his name stuns everyone. The courtroom was packed that Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago. Judge Margaret Sullivan had seen it all in her 25 years on the bench, but something about today felt different. The case seemed routine enough. A homeless man charged with disturbing the peace and trespassing. Yet the unusual number of spectators filling every seat made her pause. The defendant sat quietly at the defense table, his weathered hands folded in his lap. His clothes were clean, but clearly borrowed from a shelter donation bin. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, and despite his circumstances, he carried himself with a dignity that caught the judge's attention. The People versus Marcus Washington, the clerk announced. Judge Sullivan glanced at her papers, then looked up at the defendant. There was something familiar about that name, something that tugged at the edges of her memory, like a half-remembered song. Before we continue, if you are new to this channel, please share your city in the comment section, and remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the story. Now let's continue. Marcus Washington had been living on the streets of Chicago for 3 years. Once upon a time, he had worn a different uniform, the dress blues of the United States Marine Corps, but that felt like a lifetime ago, buried under layers of disappointment, bureaucratic nightmares, and a system that seemed designed to forget its heroes the moment they needed help. The charges against him were simple enough. 2 weeks earlier, Marcus had been sleeping in the doorway of Riverside Community Center when police officers found him just after midnight. The building housed several businesses, including a law firm that had complained repeatedly about homeless individuals using their property as shelter. "Sir, you can't sleep here," Officer Rodriguez had said, shaking Marcus awake gently. Despite working this beat for 5 years, Rodriguez had never gotten used to rousing people from what might be their only safe sleep of the night. Marcus had awakened immediately, his military training still sharp despite years on the streets. "Sorry, officer. I'll move along." But as Marcus gathered his few belongings, a worn backpack containing everything he owned, a group of teenagers walked by. They were clearly intoxicated, laughing loudly and stumbling down the sidewalk. One of them, emboldened by alcohol and peer pressure, shouted at Marcus, "Hey, old man, why don't you get a job instead of being a burden on society?" The others laughed, and one threw an empty bottle that shattered near Marcus's feet. What happened next would change everything. Marcus could have walked away, should have walked away, but when he saw the teenagers approach an elderly woman coming out of the late-night pharmacy across the street, something in him snapped. The woman was clearly frightened, clutching her purse as the group surrounded her, their intentions becoming increasingly clear. Without hesitation, Marcus dropped his backpack and crossed the street. "Leave her alone," he said firmly, positioning himself between the woman and the teenagers. "Mind your own business, homeless guy." One of them sneered, pushing Marcus backward. The confrontation escalated quickly. When one of the teenagers pulled out a knife and lunged toward the elderly woman, Marcus's military training took over. In a series of swift, precise movements, he disarmed the attacker and subdued 2 others until police backup arrived. The elderly woman was safe, but in the chaos, Marcus had technically violated his order to move along and was still on private property. Despite saving someone from what could have been a serious crime, he was arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace. The public defender assigned to Marcus's case was Sarah Chun, a young lawyer with idealistic dreams that hadn't yet been crushed by an overwhelming caseload. When she first met Marcus in the holding cell, she expected another routine case. Plea bargain, community service, move on to the next file. Instead, she found a man whose story didn't fit the usual narrative. "Mr. Washington," she said, sitting across from him in the cramped interview room, "tell me what happened that night." Marcus's account was clear, detailed, and completely at odds with the police report, which focused only on the disturbance and trespassing, barely mentioning the attempted robbery he had prevented. "How long have you been on the streets?" Sarah asked. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Marcus replied without hesitation. The precision of his answer surprised her. "What happened? How did you end up here?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had lived through more than his share of disappointment. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. When I came back, I had trouble adjusting. The VA said they'd help, but the paperwork got lost. Then lost again. I couldn't work, the nightmares, the flashbacks. My wife tried to understand, but he trailed off. I lost my job, then my house, then my family. The VA finally approved my disability claim last month, but by then, I'd been on the streets so long I didn't know how to get back. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She had heard variations of this story before, but something about Marcus was different. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself. There was a depth there that suggested a story much bigger than what appeared in his file. Mr. Washington, what was your rank in the Marines? Master Sergeant, he replied. What unit? 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. Sarah made a note to research his military background. Something told her this case was about to become much more complicated. That evening, Sarah stayed late at the office, digging into Marcus Washington's background. What she found made her hands shake as she read. Master Sergeant Marcus Washington wasn't just any veteran. According to military records, he had been awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action during his 2nd tour in Afghanistan. The citation described how he had single-handedly held off an enemy attack long enough for his unit to evacuate wounded comrades, despite being injured himself. But that wasn't all. During his 3rd tour, Marcus had been part of a classified operation that had saved the lives of an entire village, including American civilian contractors who had been taken hostage by insurgents. The details were mostly redacted, but what Sarah could piece together painted a picture of genuine heroism. Yet here he was, facing charges for trying to help someone else. Sarah dug deeper. She found the bureaucratic nightmare that had derailed Marcus's life. A combination of lost paperwork, understaffed VA offices, and a system overwhelmed by returning veterans. His disability claims had been filed and refiled multiple times. His benefits had been delayed by technicalities and clerical errors. Most heartbreaking of all, she found a letter from his ex-wife, filed with his disability claim. In it, she described watching the man she loved disappear, consumed by trauma and bureaucratic battles, until she couldn't hold their family together anymore. The letter ended with a plea for anyone, to help the man who had given so much for his country. Sarah also tracked down the elderly woman Marcus had protected, Mrs. Eleanor Rodriguez, ironically, the mother of the police officer who had arrested Marcus. When Sarah called her, Mrs. Rodriguez was eager to talk. That man is a hero, she said emphatically. Those boys would have hurt me badly if he hadn't stepped in. He didn't have to help me. He could have walked away, but he didn't. And now he's being punished for protecting me? That's not right. Word of Marcus's story began to leak out. A local reporter picked up on the case, intrigued by the contradiction between the charges and the defendant's background. The story exploded on social media. War hero arrested for helping elderly woman. The narrative struck a nerve. Veterans groups rallied to Marcus's defense. The local VFW Post started a legal defense fund. Social media campaigns sprang up overnight, demanding justice for the man who had served his country only to be failed by it. But the attention also brought scrutiny. Some questioned whether Marcus was really the hero his supporters claimed. Others argued that his homelessness and the circumstances of his arrest proved he was just another veteran who couldn't handle civilian life. The debate raged in comment sections and talk radio shows. Was Marcus Washington a hero being persecuted, or was the system right to prosecute him regardless of his military service? Judge Sullivan found herself at the center of a media storm she hadn't asked for. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Her email inbox overflowed with messages from supporters and detractors. The pressure to make the right decision, whatever that meant, was overwhelming. On the morning of the trial, the courthouse steps were lined with protesters on both sides. Veterans in uniform held signs reading, "Honor our heroes," while others carried banners demanding equal justice under law. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. News cameras rolled despite the judge's restrictions on media coverage. The air was thick with tension and expectation. Marcus sat at the defense table, wearing a suit donated by a local veterans organization. For the first time in years, he looked like the Marine he had once been, straight-backed, dignified, ready to face whatever came next. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Assistant District Attorney James Morrison presented the facts. Marcus had been told to leave private property, and had failed to do so. He had been involved in a physical altercation. The law was clear, and the defendant's military service, while admirable, didn't excuse breaking it. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Morrison said in his closing argument, "we cannot have a system where some people are above the law, no matter how much we may admire their service. The defendant chose to ignore a lawful order from a police officer. He chose to engage in a physical confrontation. These choices have consequences." Sarah's defense strategy was riskier. She called Mrs. Rodriguez to testify about the attempted robbery Marcus had prevented. She presented evidence of his military service and the bureaucratic failures that had led to his homelessness. She argued that Marcus had acted not as a lawbreaker, but as a protector, the same role he had played throughout his military career. "My client has spent his entire adult life serving others," Sarah told the jury. "He served his country in Afghanistan, risking his life repeatedly for the freedom we all enjoy. When he came home broken and needing help, the system failed him. Yet even living on the streets, forgotten by the very country he had served, his first instinct when he saw someone in danger was to help. That's not the action of a criminal. That's the action of a hero." But it was Marcus's own testimony that transformed the courtroom. When Sarah called Marcus to the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the chance to hear directly from the man at the center of the storm. Marcus walked to the witness stand with military bearing, his back straight and his eyes forward. When he raised his right hand to be sworn in, several veterans in the gallery stood in silent salute. "Mr. Washington," Sarah began, "please tell the court what happened on the night of your arrest." Marcus's voice was clear and steady as he recounted the events. He spoke without emotion about being roused from sleep, about gathering his belongings, about preparing to move on as the officer had requested. "Then I saw those young men approach Mrs. Rodriguez," he said. "I saw the fear in her eyes, and I knew what was about to happen. In that moment, I had a choice to make." "What choice was that?" "I could walk away, follow the officer's order, and let an innocent woman get hurt. Or I could do what I was trained to do, protect those who can't protect themselves." "Even though you knew it might get you in trouble?" Marcus looked directly at the jury. "I took an oath when I became a Marine. I swore to protect the innocent and defend those who couldn't defend themselves. That oath didn't expire when I left the service. It didn't become void when I lost my house or when I ended up on the streets." The courtroom was completely silent. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life," Marcus continued. "I've failed at things that should have been simple. But I've never failed to help someone who needed it, and I wasn't going to start that night." The prosecution's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Morrison tried to emphasize that Marcus had technically broken the law, but every question only highlighted the moral complexity of the situation. Then came the moment that would be replayed on news broadcasts for weeks to come. Judge Sullivan had been listening to the testimony with growing recognition. The name Marcus Washington had nagged at her throughout the proceedings, and suddenly, she knew why. "Mr. Washington," she said during a break in testimony, "would you please state your full military service record for the court?" Sarah stood up, confused by the unusual request. "Your Honor, we've already entered his service records into evidence." "Please indulge me, Counselor. Mr. Washington, your deployments." Marcus straightened. "3 tours in Afghanistan, Your Honor. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines." "And the dates of your service?" Marcus provided the dates, his voice growing puzzled by the line of questioning. Judge Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, studying the man before her. Then she did something unprecedented. She stepped down from the bench and walked to the defense table. "Mr. Washington, do you remember Operation Phantom Strike, October 15th, 2012? The color drained from Marcus's face. Yes, Your Honor. Do you remember rescuing 4 civilian contractors from insurgents? Yes, Your Honor. The judge's voice broke slightly. One of those contractors was my son, Michael Sullivan. He was working as a communications specialist with the State Department. The courtroom erupted. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. The gallery buzzed with shocked whispers. Judge Sullivan raised her hand for silence. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. My son came home from that deployment and told me about a Marine who had risked everything to save him and 3 other Americans. He said this Marine had been wounded in the rescue, but had refused medical attention until every contractor was safely evacuated. My son said he owed his life to Master Sergeant Marcus Washington. She turned to face the packed courtroom. I've spent sleepless nights wondering how I could ever repay the man who brought my son home. I never imagined I would meet him in my courtroom, charged with a crime for doing exactly what he did in Afghanistan, protecting the innocent. The trial took an unexpected turn. Judge Sullivan recused herself from the case due to her personal connection, but not before addressing the courtroom. I cannot preside over this case, given my personal involvement, she said, but I can speak as a mother whose son is alive today because of the defendant's courage. Marcus Washington is not a criminal. He is a hero who has been failed by every system that should have supported him. The case was assigned to Judge Robert Hayes, a veteran himself who had served in Vietnam. When court reconvened 2 days later, the atmosphere had completely changed. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood with tears in his eyes. We find the defendant not guilty on all charges. The courtroom exploded in cheers. Veterans in the gallery stood and saluted. Mrs. Rodriguez wept with relief. Marcus sat quietly, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. But the real justice came after the trial. The media attention from the trial accomplished what years of bureaucratic fighting had not. Within a week, Marcus's VA benefits were fully processed and backdated. A local veterans organization provided him with temporary housing, and several employers reached out with job offers. Judge Sullivan, speaking now as a private citizen and grateful mother, became an advocate for veterans' rights. She worked with Sarah Chun to establish a legal clinic specifically for homeless veterans, ensuring that others wouldn't face the bureaucratic nightmares that had derailed Marcus's life. Mrs. Rodriguez became an unlikely friend, visiting Marcus regularly and treating him like the son she had never had. Her own son, Officer Rodriguez, was so moved by the story that he began carrying information about veteran services in his patrol car, helping connect homeless veterans with resources instead of simply arresting them. The teenagers who had attempted to rob Mrs. Rodriguez were eventually caught and charged. Ironically, they received harsher sentences than Marcus had faced for stopping them. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came 3 weeks after the trial, when Marcus was finally reunited with his ex-wife and daughter at a ceremony honoring local veterans. "I never stopped loving you," his ex-wife, Patricia, told him through tears. "I just didn't know how to fight the system that was destroying you. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to stay." Marcus, wearing his dress blues for the first time in years, held his teenage daughter, now taller than he remembered and beautiful in ways that broke his heart. "You did what you had to do to protect our daughter," he told Patricia. "That's what good mothers do. I don't blame you for anything." Marcus's story became a rallying cry for veterans' rights and homelessness prevention. It highlighted the tragic irony of a system that trains young people to be warriors, sends them to fight for their country, and then abandons them when they return home broken. The case prompted congressional hearings on veteran services. New legislation was introduced to streamline benefits processing and provide emergency housing for homeless veterans. While change was slow, Marcus's story had planted seeds that would grow into meaningful reform. But the most important change was in how people saw homelessness itself. Marcus's story challenged the comfortable narratives that allow society to ignore people sleeping on the streets. It forced people to confront the reality that homelessness can happen to anyone, even heroes. "Every person on the street has a story," Marcus said in interviews after the trial. "Mine just happened to be one that people could relate to because I wore a uniform. But the woman with mental illness sleeping behind the grocery store? She's somebody's daughter. The old man with the shopping cart full of bottles? He might have been a teacher, a father, a person who mattered to someone. They all deserve dignity and help, not just the ones with medals. 6 months after the trial, Marcus Washington stood before a group of young Marines about to deploy overseas. He had been invited to speak about service and sacrifice, but also about coming home. You're going to see things that will change you, he told them. You're going to do things that will stay with you forever. That's the price of being a warrior, and it's a price worth paying to protect the people you love. He paused, looking at their young faces, so eager, so brave, so unaware of what lay ahead. But when you come home, and you will come home, remember that your service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. The same courage that will get you through combat, the same commitment to protecting others, the same refusal to quit. You're going to need all of that in civilian life too. Marcus now worked as a veterans advocate, helping other former service members navigate the bureaucracy that had once defeated him. He had a small apartment, a steady job, and regular contact with his daughter. Most importantly, he had purpose again. But he never forgot the streets, or the people still living on them. Every Friday night, Marcus and a group of volunteers, including Mrs. Rodriguez and several veterans from his old unit who had tracked him down after seeing the news coverage, distributed food and supplies to Chicago's homeless population. They didn't just hand out sandwiches and blankets. They listened to stories, helped with paperwork, made phone calls, and treated each person they met with the dignity that Marcus had been denied for so long. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption, Marcus would tell his volunteers. Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them long enough for them to believe in themselves again. 1 year after his trial, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. Judge Margaret Sullivan was retiring from the bench and had requested that he speak at her retirement ceremony. I became a judge because I believed in justice, she told the gathered crowd of lawyers, court officers, and community members. But it wasn't until I met Marcus Washington that I truly understood what justice means. She looked directly at Marcus, who sat in the front row with his daughter beside him. Justice isn't just about following the law. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person who appears before you. It's about understanding that the person sitting in the defendant's chair might be the same person who once risked everything to save your child. The ceremony was emotional, but it was the conversation afterward that meant the most to Marcus. I want you to know, Judge Sullivan told him privately, that my son Michael has never forgotten what you did for him. He's now working with refugee resettlement programs, helping people who have lost everything start over in America. He says you taught him that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid. Marcus smiled. Sounds like he learned the right lesson. He learned it from the right teacher. As Marcus drove home that evening, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. A year ago, he had been sleeping in doorways and digging through garbage cans for food. Tonight, he would sleep in his own bed and wake up to meaningful work. The transformation seemed miraculous, but Marcus knew it wasn't magic that had changed his life. It was people willing to see past his circumstances to the person he had always been inside. Marcus's advocacy work brought him into contact with hundreds of homeless veterans, each with their own story of service and loss. Some, like Marcus, had fallen through bureaucratic cracks. Others struggled with addiction, mental illness, or physical disabilities that made employment impossible. All of them taught him something about resilience, dignity, and the thin line between success and failure that exists in every life. One case particularly affected him. Thomas Chun, a Vietnam veteran who had been living under a bridge for 15 years. Thomas had been exposed to Agent Orange during his service and had developed cancer as a result. His VA disability claim had been denied multiple times due to missing documentation from a fire at a military records center a decade earlier. Marcus spent months helping Thomas gather alternative documentation, fighting through the same bureaucratic maze that had once trapped him. When Thomas finally received his benefits and was able to afford cancer treatment, The victory felt as significant as any military operation Marcus had ever been part of. "You saved my life," Thomas told him. "You would have done the same for me," Marcus replied, and meant it. This was the brotherhood that Marcus had missed most during his time on the streets. The knowledge that someone had your back, that your struggles mattered to someone else, that you weren't fighting alone. As Marcus's story became more widely known, he was invited to speak at schools, community centers, and military bases across the country. He always accepted these invitations, seeing them as opportunities to plant seeds that might prevent the next generation from making the same mistakes that society had made with his generation. At a high school in Detroit, a student asked him, "How do you not hate the country that abandoned you?" Marcus thought carefully before answering, "I don't hate America because America isn't just the government or the bureaucracy that failed me. America is also Mrs. Rodriguez, who saw a person in need instead of a problem to be avoided. America is Judge Sullivan, who recognized justice when she saw it. America is every person who donated to my legal defense fund or wrote letters supporting veterans' rights." He paused, looking out at the young faces before him. "America is you, the next generation that will decide how we treat our veterans, our homeless, our most vulnerable citizens. The country that abandoned me exists, but so does the country that saved me. Which America do you want to live in?" The question sparked discussions that continued long after Marcus left the building. Marcus's story had created ripples that extended far beyond his individual case. The legal clinic established by Judge Sullivan and Sarah Chun had helped hundreds of veterans resolve benefits issues and housing problems. The media coverage had prompted other cities to reconsider how they handled homeless populations, particularly veterans. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the criminal justice system itself. Prosecutors across the country began implementing veterans' courts that focused on treatment and support rather than punishment for veterans accused of minor crimes related to their service-connected disabilities. Marcus was invited to serve on the advisory board of one such court in Chicago. During the first session he attended, he watched a young veteran, barely out of his teens, stand before the judge, charged with public intoxication and disorderly conduct. The young man's story was heartbreakingly familiar. Deployed to Iraq at 18, returned with PTSD and survivor's guilt, started drinking to numb the pain, lost his job and apartment, and ended up on the streets. Instead of jail time, the Veterans Court ordered treatment, housing assistance, and regular check-ins with a counselor. Marcus volunteered to be the young man's mentor, helping him navigate the same systems that had once seemed impossibly complex. "Why are you helping me?" the young veteran, David, asked during one of their meetings. "Because someone helped me when I needed it most," Marcus replied. "That's how it works. We lift each other up." 3 years after his trial, Marcus Washington had become a recognized advocate for veterans' rights and homelessness prevention. He had testified before Congress, advised city governments, and helped draft legislation that would prevent other veterans from falling through the cracks. But he had also maintained his connection to the street-level work that had given his advocacy authenticity. Every week, he still went out with volunteers to distribute supplies and offer assistance to Chicago's homeless population. On one of these nights, he encountered a familiar face, one of the teenagers who had attempted to rob Mrs. Rodriguez that night 3 years ago. The young man, now 21, was coming out of a job training program at the community center. "Mr. Washington," the young man said, clearly surprised to see him. Marcus recognized him immediately, but showed no anger or resentment. "How are you doing, son?" I wanted to apologize," the young man stammered, "for that night, for what we tried to do, for the things we said to you." "What's your name?" Marcus asked. Danny Martinez." "Well, Danny, we all make mistakes when we're young. The question is what we learn from them. What did you learn?" Danny was quiet for a moment. "I learned that the people I thought didn't matter. People like you. People I looked down on. Those people might be better men than I was. I learned that I wanted to be someone my little sister could be proud of." Marcus smiled. "Sounds like you learned the right lesson. What are you doing now?" "I'm training to be an EMT. I want to help people instead of hurting them. They talked for a few more minutes, and Marcus gave Danny his business card. If you ever need help with anything, finding resources, dealing with bureaucracy, whatever, give me a call. That's what we do. We help each other. As Danny walked away, Marcus felt a familiar sense of completion. This was why his story mattered, not just because it had ended well for him, but because it had created opportunities for others to change, grow, and contribute. Marcus Washington's story raises uncomfortable questions about how society treats its most vulnerable members. How many heroes are sleeping on our streets right now, invisible to the people who pass them every day? How many people with stories worth telling, lives worth saving, have we dismissed as problems to be managed rather than human beings to be helped? The night Marcus was arrested for helping Mrs. Rodriguez, dozens of people walked past the confrontation without stopping. They saw a homeless man fighting with teenagers and made assumptions about who was the victim and who was the threat. Only Mrs. Rodriguez knew the truth, that sometimes the person who looks most dangerous is actually the one keeping you safe. This is the deeper lesson of Marcus's story, that we cannot judge people by their circumstances without understanding their journey. The veteran sleeping in the doorway might be the same person who once carried wounded comrades to safety. The woman pushing a shopping cart might be a former teacher who lost everything to medical bills. The man asking for change might be someone's father, trying to survive long enough to find his way back to his family. Marcus's trial became a mirror, reflecting society's values and priorities back to itself. The same system that had failed to help him when he was struggling was quick to prosecute him when he helped someone else. The same community that had ignored him when he was invisible suddenly rallied to his defense when his story became public. The question this raises is not whether Marcus deserved justice. He clearly did. The question is whether justice should depend on having a compelling story that resonates with the public. What about the veterans whose service was less dramatic, whose falls from grace were less photogenic, whose stories don't make headlines? Marcus himself grappled with this question. Why had his case generated so much support when thousands of other veterans faced similar struggles in obscurity? I got lucky, he would often say. I had a story that people could understand and relate to. But every person on the street has a story. Every person deserves help, not just the ones whose stories make good television. This understanding drove his advocacy work. Marcus used his platform not just to tell his own story, but to amplify the voices of others who remained invisible. He insisted that every speech he gave, every interview he did, include references to the broader issues of homelessness and veterans care. He also never forgot that his salvation had come through the actions of individuals, Mrs. Rodriguez, who testified on his behalf, Sarah Chun, who fought for him, Judge Sullivan, who recognized him, the community members who rallied to his cause. Systems had failed him, but people had saved him. Change happens one person at a time. Marcus would tell audiences, you can't fix the whole system overnight, but you can help one person today. And if everyone helps one person, pretty soon you've helped everyone. This philosophy guided everything Marcus did. He helped individual veterans navigate bureaucracy. He mentored young people making poor choices. He volunteered at shelters and food banks. He treated every person he encountered as someone worth saving, because he knew what it felt like to be considered worthless. The transformation in Marcus's life was dramatic, but it wasn't magic. It was the result of people choosing to see his humanity instead of his circumstances, to focus on his potential instead of his problems, to offer help instead of judgment. His story proves that redemption is possible, that second chances can lead to meaningful change, and that the person society has written off might be the one who ends up changing society. But it also highlights how precarious that redemption can be. Marcus was one bureaucratic error, one unkind judge, one unsympathetic jury away from a very different ending. His story could easily have been about a war hero who died on the streets, forgotten and alone. The difference was people willing to fight for him when he couldn't fight for himself. The difference was a community that chose compassion over convenience, justice over judgment. As Marcus often said in his speeches, I didn't save myself. Other people saved me. And now it's my turn to help save others. This is the true lesson of his story. Not that individual strength and determination are enough to overcome any obstacle, but that we are all responsible for each other. That the veteran sleeping in the park, the woman begging at the intersection, the man digging through trash cans, they are all our responsibility. Just as Marcus became the responsibility of everyone who heard his story and chose to act. The question his story poses is not whether Marcus Washington deserved justice. The question is, what do we owe each other? How do we create a society where Marcus's story becomes impossible? Not because people don't fall through the cracks, but because we've built a system with no cracks to fall through. These are the questions that matter long after the headlines fade and the cameras move on to other stories. These are the questions that will determine whether Marcus's story becomes an inspiration for change or just another feel-good tale that lets us pat ourselves on the back while doing nothing to help the next Marcus Washington. Now, here's the question that will determine everything. If you saw someone like Marcus, homeless, forgotten, struggling, would you see a problem to be avoided or a person worth saving? How many heroes are we walking past every day without ever knowing their stories? The truth is, we all have the power to change someone's life, just like the people who changed Marcus's life. But it requires us to look beyond appearances and see the humanity in everyone we meet. What will you choose to see? If this story moved you and made you think differently about the people you pass on the street every day, please subscribe to Beyond Yesterday for more incredible true stories that will challenge your assumptions and restore your faith in humanity. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because everyone deserves to have their story heard.